Today I'm going to talk just a little bit about cumulative impacts in Pennsylvania law, and the topic is actually a little bit broader than that. I am going to be talking about Pennsylvania law application specifically, but I'm going to be talking about cumulative impacts analysis more broadly, and also some analyses in federal law as well. I want this to be a very interactive discussion. A couple of reasons for that. First, looking out, there are people with a lot more experience in this field than I have, and I'd really like to gain from that experience, and I'd like everyone to do that. So please feel free to ask questions at any time. Interrupt if you've had experiences that you'd like to share, anything on topic. If you hear me say something wrong, hopefully you won't, but please feel free to add that as well. And the second reason I'm doing that is because I can't think of anything more boring on a Saturday afternoon than listening to myself speak for 60 minutes straight, so let's try to avoid that. All right, I'm learning how to use this board at the same time. That's fun. So I'll talk through some of the things I'm going to talk about today. Just talk briefly about cumulative impacts in general. And this is something that's come up. It came up in the keynote session this morning. They were talking about that in the context of the Robinson Township decision. And it's something that's come up in both of the breakout sessions that I was in this morning in this room. So if you've been in this room all day, you've heard quite a bit about cumulative impacts already. So I'll talk just generally about what it is, what it means, how we think about it. Next thing we'll talk about, really, I'm saying examples in federal law and examples in state law. Really what I'm going to do is talk in some detail about NEPA under federal law and in some detail about Chapter 105 permits in Pennsylvania law. And then we'll talk about, just very briefly, some of the other places where cumulative impacts analyses show up in each of those levels. And then finally, and I'd really like to have some discussion on this. I have discussion questions. I'd like to get some feedback. I went to school at a place that was very theoretical, thought that actually learning law was a waste of time during law school. So we spent a lot of time talking about policy and discussing the way things should be instead of the way things actually are. So I'd like to do a little bit of that when we get to the end and get some ideas for how you think we should be addressing cumulative impacts. And I'll give some examples. I'm talking about cumulative impacts throughout the whole thing, but I'll give some almost alternative ways of handling cumulative impacts. We'll talk about some of those, and then we'll have, hopefully, a discussion at the end about maybe how we can handle it better. So spoiler alert, I'm not going to have a conclusion at the end of this presentation. It's very open-ended. There's a lot out there. The only thing I would say is that I don't think we're handling cumulative impacts very well at all overall, and I think that's something that's been a theme of the morning, at least in the presentations that I've been in. And I think it's something that we need to pay more attention to, especially as population keeps growing and the economy keeps growing and we keep developing more and more areas of our land. We need to be conscious of that. Okay, so this is the big picture. I stole this quote from a 1997 federal guidance that I think lays things out pretty well. This is what we're talking about when we're talking cumulative impacts. Says, evidence is increasing that the most devastating environmental effects may result not from the direct effects of a particular action, but from the combination of individually minor effects of multiple actions over time, and that's what we're focusing on. This isn't one big project that's going to obliterate the entire area. This is death by 1,000 cuts. This is one little well here and one housing development here, and one new pipeline here and a road here, and all of a sudden, the entire forest is worthless to the native habitat, or native flora and fauna. Okay, so, and again, what do we mean by cumulative impacts? We're talking about environmental impacts that are created by other projects. When we're talking about an analysis of cumulative impacts in a project, we're not just talking about the effects that come from what's happening in that project, we're talking about the effects that are happening as a result of all of the other projects that have happened. That's what we're thinking about when we're talking cumulative impacts. And I'm taking this language, past, present, or reasonably foreseeable future. That's coming from what we'll talk about later, NEPA. It's the National Environmental Policy Act. That comes from their definition of cumulative impact. So it's everything that has happened, is happening, and will happen in a given area that will have an environmental impact on the same resource in the same geographic area as the project being considered. So you just have some simple examples listed here, but all right, here's where I want to get a little bit interactive. I'd like to start talking about some ideas for what kind of cumulative impacts or what kind of effects a project would have, and just to go through the exercise pretty quickly. Yeah.
Development that increases impervious area would affect the heating of, like, making water warmer and also increasing the flow of swim water.
Okay, so there are a couple things there. This marker's a little bad, but we'll make it work. Sorry. So thermal impacts and stormwater runoff. So yeah, what I'd like to do is, and I'll do this pretty quickly. Thanks. And this is the right board, right?
Yes.
All right. Now that I've completely destroyed it if I was wrong. But what I'd like to talk about a pipeline project. And for people who are in this room this morning, you have a pretty good idea and you've had a head start on this because the last presenter spoke at length about some of the impacts of a pipeline project. But I'd like to talk about the environmental impacts of a pipeline project, and then we'll, as we go through, I'll keep coming back to this, and we'll talk about doing basically cumulative impacts analysis, at least in a very simple, basic way that we can do sitting in a room here without external resources for less than an hour. So Mark mentioned thermal impacts, stormwater impacts. Can anybody think of any other environmental resources that would be affected by a pipeline?
Spread of invasives.
Invasive species. Anybody else?
Cutting through like existing forests, it would use
Forest segmentation?
segment. There you go.
There we go.
Segmentation.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a big one, especially when we're talking about pipelines, electricity, transmission lines, those kinds of things, the long linear projects. Anything else?
Soil disturbances.
I'm sorry.
Soil disturbances.
Soil disturbances, absolutely.
Loss of vegetation.
Okay. So plant life impacts. And this is somewhat related to the stormwater. Oops, go ahead.
Stream crossing impact.
Stream crossing impacts. Absolutely. And how about next to the streams, we often have wetlands. Exactly. Wetland impacts. How about the pipeline? We're usually talking about some sort of natural gas, fossil fuel, that kind of thing. How about air impacts coming from, basically, we're going to have additional drilling that comes as a result. It's going to run through and it's probably going to be burned. So how about air quality?
Property disputes.
Property disputes, yeah. And let's talk about that more broadly. It's how about cultural impacts and social impacts?
Yeah, like social justice is often how it's phrased, so social justice issues.
I like that, yeah.
Increased risk of, spillage or something.
So, yeah, that's probably land contamination, right? And land and or water contamination. That could be a water quality thing too, depending on where it spills.
How about the visual?
Aesthetic. All right. We could probably do this for the rest of the hour. And but we'll stop here. The one thing I do want to add, and it came up a little bit here, but also greenhouse gas, climate change sort of a thing. And there are absolutely more, and we could go on forever and ever, but I think this is good enough for what I want to do. These are the effects that can come from one single project. It's a big project. This is a pretty big example. It's not a small housing development or development of one property. It's a pretty big development that's, to help illustrate, it does have a lot of effects. So here we're talking about, and I'll just do this briefly now, but we're talking about impacts on the same resource in the same geographic area. So one of the other things that when we're talking about and thinking about cumulative impacts, one of the things we have to think about is what's the geographic area that will be affected by the project. So, when we're talking about something like forest segmentation, and it's hard, we're talking in the abstract, but what do you think a good geographic scope of the impacts of forest segmentation would be? Where should we study that to determine what impact this pipeline project is going to have on the forest segmentation resource? We're probably talking something somewhat local in scope. We're talking not necessarily immediately within the project boundaries, but probably within the same watershed or same, I'll call it local.
Your linear project is going to destroy the interior forest within 300 feet.
Okay, and that's 300 feet throughout the entire length of the project.
Yes.
So that's that's still pretty significant if we're talking about a 100-mile long pipeline. Access roads. Yeah, and that would certainly all have to be contemplated with these, when we're talking about all of these different impacts, and you're right, that extends it. I'm going to use the word local just to talk about local to the scope of the project, so it's fairly close to the scope of the project. I think a lot of these things, maybe that some of them, I'm trying to think, maybe when we're talking about land contamination, we may be talking simply within the area of disturbance or very close to it, so it's probably a little bit smaller than this area we're talking about here. How about climate change? What do you think the relevance area, geographic area is for that? It's global. It's absolutely global. So that's just something, and we'll come back to that a little bit. I'm going to keep revisiting this throughout the presentation, but I just wanted to get that out here now. Okay, so I'm going to start talking now about some of the federal law assessments of cumulative impacts. There we go. I'm still learning the screen. So NEPA, this is the National Environmental Policy Act. And again, I think most of the people in this room are probably familiar with it. I'll just go through it quickly because it is relevant to what we're talking about here. It requires federal agencies to prepare basically an environmental analysis document that would identify and analyze any environmental effects of a major federal action. And federal actions, it's a term of art. It's defined in the law. It includes a lot of different things, including, among other things, permitting. So, when if we're talking about something like a long linear project, like a pipeline that crosses state boundaries, it has to be permitted by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That decision to issue that permit is considered a major federal action that has to go through the NEPA process. And there are all kinds of examples that I'm sure you're all familiar with on many different levels. As part of that analysis, in either an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, the federal agency who's putting together the document has to follow CEQ regulations, and it must include a discussion of cumulative impacts, which is what we're talking about here. So what is cumulative impacts? This is a lot of legal jargon for exactly what we were talking about before. It's the impact on the environment which results from the incremental impact of the action when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future actions, regardless of what agency or person undertakes those actions. It can result from individually minor but collectively significant actions taking place over a period of time. So again, anything, basically. It doesn't matter if it's not the federal government that completed that project. It doesn't matter that again, over a period of time, it doesn't matter that it's been in place since Ben Franklin was walking around the streets of Philadelphia. It doesn't matter, if it's reasonably foreseeable that something's going to happen 200 years from now, and there's probably not much that's actually reasonably foreseeable 200 years out, but that would also have to be included. It's a very, very, very broad definition. And I think you can kind of see where we're going with some of this. Just lots of information, lots of difficulty. Jim, did you?
Yeah, I would just comment, Mike, that the CEQ regulations are interesting because they do require some of these things. But since the Reagan administration, they have been virtually gutted from their substance because everything is now categorical exclusions and environmental assessments, so they're very rare. And the substance and the reach and scope of EISs is pretty feeble at the federal level.
Yes. No, I completely agree with that. And even in places where there are EISs, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, where cumulative impacts assessments are out there, we're not getting everything that I think should be incorporated just reading from this definition. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So legally speaking, what do you have to have a meaningful cumulative impacts analysis? And this is some of the things we've been talking about. Geographic area in which the effects of the project will be felt, and that's what we're talking about. So, and this is resource-based. So we have this list of resources. We could probably fill up another 2 boards with the other resources. For each one of those, the person or the agency developing the EIS has to determine what the geographic area that will be affected is. Climate change is global. Some of the other things we're talking about, forest segmentation, is a little more local. Some may be even more narrow than that. Some may be broader. Some may be intermediate. Then, once they've done that, they have to talk about the impacts that are expected in that area from the project. And again, the impacts may have different geographic scopes. Then, for each one of those impacts, they have to identify other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future actions that will affect the same area. So let's just talk about one. Let's talk about forest segmentation. What can we think of any other past, present, or reasonably foreseeable future actions that would have an effect on forest fragmentation or forest segmentation? How about housing developments? What was that?
Oh, power lines.
Power lines for sure.
Logging.
Logging? Yeah.
Highways.
Highways?
Access roads for natural gas wells.
Pipelines.
Other pipelines. Especially in that, if you were here this morning, I can't remember the name of the presenter. I think it was Steve. Yes, thank you. He had a map showing just Pennsylvania and all the pipelines across Pennsylvania, and it is significant. They're all over the place.
And getting worse.
And yeah, and there are lots more planned. It's going to keep getting worse. So we can keep going. Almost everything affects forest fragmentation. Any development in an area that is or once was forested affects that. So we have that list of the other actions in the same area. Then the next piece is the impacts from the other actions in that area. So what effect does each housing development have? What effect does each power line have? What effect? And so again, you're going to have a tree that's sort of like this. And it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger if we're doing this properly.
How extensive do they look at the impacts? Not
Yeah.
and
that-
like
yeah.
the low-hanging fruit of like, oh, it's going to be this generic.
Yeah,
Anywhere.
Yeah, I think, and that's what we'll talk about a little later, and that's what Jim is alluding to. This is sort of an ideal in some ways, and I think what you'll see what's actually done is much more minimal than this. And part of what they can do and part of what they do when we're talking about past effects is they can aggregate in some ways and just look at, instead of looking at each individual housing development, there are ways they can study it in a way that brings everything together in a way that makes it a little easier. But
Was any of that language guidance components of a meaningful analysis previously embodied in either CEQ guidance or rules or anything?
so this comes from case law. I'm citing a Delaware Riverkeeper case because we're at a Delaware Riverkeeper event. This was an important case that actually was decided last summer, but I think this language goes back to the mid-1980s. So it has been, if you look at some guidances, it's been incorporated into some guidance documents, or at least the application of this language. I don't know that any CEQ or any agencies have explicitly adopted this as guidance language, but this is a generally accepted standard that came from federal case law.
It's been around but ignored.
In many ways, it has. In many ways, it has. And that's what we're hoping to come to the answer to today. We're going to fix that problem today, somehow, I think. Yeah. Maybe. At least you are. I'm not. So then at the very end, the overall impact that can be expected if the individual impacts are allowed to accumulate. So that's taking all of these trees, adding them up, and taking the sum. And that's the bottom line. That's what we're looking at for cumulative impacts. And you can see, again, just looking at the definitions, looking at the standards, how complicated, how complex, how expensive it would be to put that together. So it kind of gives us an idea when we're talking, I'm doing this for two reasons. First of all, I'm going to be a little bit of an apologist for some of the industry and some of the environmental agencies because it's certainly difficult, and the fact that it's not being done adequately is understandable. And that'll make it a little bit less painful later when I kind of slam them for not doing what I'm saying is almost impossible to do. But I do want to lay that out there to give everyone a sense of what we're talking about and why it's important. We were at the keynote session this morning. We were all talking about how important it is to think about this because so many of our policy decisions are made at an individual project level. We're talking about permitting. The permitting agency is looking at this specific pipeline. It's looking at this specific gas well. It's looking at this specific, and you know, all of these things, you know, that one project may have a very minor impact, but again, it's the death by a thousand cuts analysis that we were talking about before. It's in the aggregate that those really have a big impact, and it is important. It's very significant in the long run. It's just how do we accommodate that in the legal and policy world. Okay, so talked about cumulative impacts under NEPA. I'm going to go through quickly the process that NEPA goes through. Again, I think most people are familiar with it, but the reason I'm doing this, I just want people to understand, you know, if you're interested in becoming involved in a NEPA process to help agencies more adequately address this, this is what we're looking at. This is, at least quickly, in a nutshell, how it would work. One thing I do want to point out at the beginning is this is the general standard. This comes from the CEQ regulations, which apply to all NEPA actions. Each federal agency that has to do one of these has its own, almost everyone has its own set of NEPA regulations. So this, again, this is broad guidelines. Each agency is going to be a little bit different. So, you know, when we're looking at any one given action, we should definitely make sure we look up the regulations for that action to figure out how to get involved, if that's what we're talking about. And this is something, okay, so for every action a federal agency takes, this is something that Jim alluded to earlier. It has to decide, does that action fall within a categorical exclusion? And basically what that means is most agencies, by regulation, have defined a certain set of their actions, a category of their actions, that they consider excluded from this because they've decided as a class these impacts don't have a significant impact. You know, they're not a major federal action that has a significant impact on the environment. So there are lots of things like that. There's no NEPA analysis, no EIS, unless there's extraordinary circumstances, which is rare by the definition of extraordinary. The next one down, if it doesn't fall within a categorical exclusion, the agency may decide to perform an environmental assessment, which I think, again, most people are familiar with. It's a smaller version of an environmental impact statement. It goes through some of the effects, and basically the bottom line is this a major federal action that would have a significant effect on the environment? If so, then the agency has to go forward and submit an EIS, to draft an EIS and make that available to the public. If not, they'll just create what's called a FONSI, finding of no significant impact, and move on from there. That's the end of the NEPA analysis. And then finally, if they decide that it is a major federal action with significant impacts on the human environment, then we go to an EIS. I will say there's very little room for public involvement, categorical exclusion. Depending on the agency, there can be limited room for public involvement in environmental assessment. Many agencies don't have much at all. I think the guidelines say that to the extent practicable, they should include the public. Some agencies actually do try to do that, others don't. And again, that's something that we can go through. But what I'm going to be talking about for the next couple minutes is if there is going to be an environmental impact statement, an EIS. So this is the process for the EIS. The agency will file a notice of intent, an NOI, in the Federal Register to announce the intent to prepare an EIS and to initiate the scoping process. Scoping is basically something that looks like this. It involves the public, it involves other government agencies, it involves public hearings, and the goal of the scoping process is to say what are the resources that are going to be affected, what's the geographic scope of it, what are the temporal limitations on that, on the project, on the effects of the project. You know, what are we looking at? What do we have to look at? Let's make sure we know everything that there is to know about the effects of this project. Using that information, the agency drafts a draft EIS, environmental impact statement, publishes that draft EIS, and then there's a public comment period which is required to last at least 45 days. It can be longer, depends on the agency. Public can comment on the EIS, and then the agency takes those comments into consideration and publishes the final EIS, the FEIS, and then publishes a record of decision 30 days after that. So, how do we get involved? What's the role for the public? Scoping, really good place to get involved. Very early in the process, it lets you get the issues in there, you know, under consideration early. Creates a record if somewhere down the line you decide to challenge, you know, the agency's EIS, the draft of the EIS that they put forward. You know, it shows that it was right in front of them. They had no reason not to consider it, that you were involved, that this issue was part of the record that they should consider. It makes that process a lot easier. And hopefully it will never get to that point where you'd have to challenge it, but it gets the information out there. Again, written comments are accepted by the agencies, and there are usually public hearings as well. And again, these are the kinds of things you can bring in. What are the other projects that are out there? If you're aware of a particular project in your neighborhood, in your local area that would have an effect on similar resources, make sure you mention that, because it's, government agencies may not have the same knowledge that you do, and that's the advantage of being involved in the process. Even though it seems like you're a small cog in the wheel, you're an individual, maybe you don't have specific scientific training, but you may have local knowledge that's relevant. What resources are going to be effective? Again, temporal and geographic limits, and reasonable alternatives to the project, because that's going to be another part of the EIS project, is to define reasonable alternatives to the project itself. So we don't need this whole pipeline. We can just, there's this pipeline already here that's underutilized. Let's just put some of the gas through the same pipeline, and we don't need a new one. Something like that. The next step, and I alluded to this. Yep.
Yeah. Back at the scoping stage, defining the alternatives. One that is often overlooked, but which is critical and very often gets addressed in very short shrift, is the no-build alternative, the do-nothing alternative.
Right.
And all the alternatives that are going to have some kind of impact have to be compared against the do-nothing alternative.
Right. And that is one of the things that's required under NEPA, is the no action alternative, basically. If, as you said, if we decide not to approve this permit, if we decide not to undertake this project that we're considering, what's the environmental impact of that? And presumably it's status quo. Can be different depending on what the project is, but that is important and may be worth talking about. Okay, so we get past the scoping project. The agency takes its time, goes back, drafts an environmental impact statement, publishes it for public comment. You have the opportunity again to look at that draft EIS and to comment on it. And you're probably looking at the same kinds of things. Did the agency consider all of the reasonably foreseeable future projects? Did it select an appropriate geographic boundary? Did it take a hard look at the actual environmental impacts? Or was this just a quick and dirty, let's get this done, check the box and move on? Finally, you get past that, the agency still doesn't care, finalizes the EIS, goes through, puts out its record of decision. You decide, still not good enough, I want to legally challenge this EIS. So, first thing to keep in mind, some agencies have an administrative appeal process. So before you go to court, you have to, in many cases, exhaust the administrative appeals process for that agency. Again, this is agency by agency, just something to think about. The court will review the EIS under a deferential standard. For any attorneys in the room or people who are familiar, it's basically the arbitrary or capricious standard under the Administrative Procedure Act, and it's described as the hard look analysis. Did the agency take a hard look at the environmental impacts of this project? That's the question. And these can actually be fairly successful. There was a study done, the study was done in 2005. It looked at 10 years worth of court cases involving cumulative impacts in the Ninth Circuit, which is one of the more liberal, progressive circuits out there. But they found that of 25 legal challenges brought to EISs under the alleging deficiencies in cumulative impacts, 15 of the EISs were overturned. So that's a 60% success rate. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. First among them, a lot of times this isn't taken very seriously. So
in that case, what happens? Is the project not proceed? Like, do they find that in time to stop the project, or before they and do a more thorough?
That's what should happen.
Okay.
It should go back. The agency should draft a supplemental EIS that would address the deficiencies, and then, based on the supplemental EIS, then revise its decision, or maybe take the same decision. That's the one thing about NEPA, is it doesn't require any outcome. You could find that all of the impacts, this is going to end life as we know it on the planet. Okay, that's fine. You can still approve the decision as long as you've actually done the analysis.
I'm glad to hear that there was that kind of success rate in the Ninth Circuit with those kinds of appeals, but I think to be fair, we should consider the fact that in all likelihood, the legal community out there wasn't going to take cases to appeal that weren't pretty clearly poor decisions where the arbitrary capricious standard was something they felt could be met.
Yeah.
So you got to take that into account. Another piece of data would be what is the broader number of EISs that got processed successfully. I'd like to see that piece of data as well.
You're absolutely right, and also the fact that we're talking about just the circuit court. So, you know, some of these cases, even if lawyers decided to bring them, may have gotten, you know, they may have lost at the lower court, the district court level, and they may not have been appealed. So these may have been some of the stronger cases, and you're absolutely right. My point is just to say that it is possible to succeed on some of these actions. It's not hopeless, not easy. You know, this is deferential to the agency for sure.
Are you familiar with the types of groups that brought those cases? Was it environmental groups or was it?
I think a lot of times it is environmental groups. The case we referred to before was Delaware Riverkeeper brought an action. You know, that just happened in the past year. It was decided by, I think it was the 6th Circuit or 4th Circuit. I don't remember, but it was a different circuit court. That just happened last year. A lot of times it is environmental groups. It could be, you know, just neighborhood citizens. You do have to establish standing as you go through the process for a federal action, and that's something I'm not really going into, but you do have to be involved in the process, at least, you know, in the build-up. You can't come in at the last minute, at least under federal law, and challenge. State law is actually different, but talking about federal law, you do have to be at least somewhat involved to establish standing. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say about NEPA, maybe? Okay, yeah, I just wanted to talk briefly. This is one other example, Section 404. This is the judge or fill federal permits. There's also a standard here that talks about minimal cumulative adverse impacts. This is supposed to be documented as the agency is drafting its general permit and considered. It's a much smaller scope. It's just talking about the aquatic ecosystem, and it has to be considered to the extent reasonable and practical in individual permit decisions. So,
I just want to point out that the general permits issued by the Corps of Engineers under Section 404, which applies to all states except about 3, including New Jersey and Michigan, as part of publishing the general permits, the Corps makes a finding that applies nationally that cumulatively, if they allow less than a quarter of an acre of fill under certain circumstances, there will be no cumulative impact of significance. So that anybody who challenges that on the general permits will have a real hard uphill battle. Now, when you get down to individual permits, it's a different story because the Corps has acknowledged that an individual permit is required because there will be more than a minimal adverse impact from that one project, and the cumulative impact of similar projects could be quite substantial.
yeah, and that's a good point. Once that factual finding is made by the government agency, it does get deference, and it's pretty tough to overturn. And that's part of what we want to talk about here too, is how do we get to that? It's not easy. So I'll talk quickly. Just let me get a sense of where we are with time. Okay, talk about at least one example under Pennsylvania law where cumulative impacts are being considered, and this is, the analysis much less developed, the legal standards for this. We're talking about the Chapter 105. You've probably heard of Chapter 105 water obstruction and encroachment permits. It's required for any structure or activity which changes, expands, diminishes the course, current, or cross-section of a water course, floodway, or body of water. Basically, if it's going to impact wetland or body of water. If it crosses the body of water, if you have a permanent impact, if you're putting a post down into a wetland, into a stream, you need a Chapter 105 permit under Pennsylvania law. So the cumulative impacts idea is built into Section 105.14 of the Pennsylvania regulations. It's 25 PA Code 105.14. And you can see, I've obviously truncated it, but this is number 14, which I'll come back to a little bit later. But in reviewing the permit application, the department must consider the cumulative impact of this project and other potential or existing projects. Sounds pretty similar to what we're talking about under federal law. Slightly different language, but we're still talking about potential or existing projects. We're clearly talking about the same idea of cumulative impacts. We'll consider whether numerous piecemeal changes may result in a major impairment of the wetland resources. And the department will evaluate a particular wetland site, basically individually. When we're talking about impacts to wetlands specifically, in order to approve the permit, the department must find that for an EV wetland exceptional value, that's basically the highest quality of wetland, has to determine the cumulative impact will not result in the impairment of wetland resources. If it's not an EV wetland, the cumulative impacts the agency has to decide will not result in a major impairment. The difference here being major impairment versus impairment. But anyway, idea being cumulative impact very clearly built into the Chapter 105 permitting process and the standards that the agency has to follow in order to issue a permit. So that's a great thing, right? Not really. So we have what we've seen, and this is something that I've done over the course of the last couple years, going through, or I should say the last really year and a half, looking at some of the permits that have been issued by the state DEP under this standard, and just to see what they've been approving. I can tell you that for each permit, they have to fill out a standard form that has a checklist of all the things that they've looked at. And one of those, there's a line with a checkbox next to it that says cumulative impacts. And they have to check that they've considered the cumulative impacts. And that's usually all you'll see on the state document. Okay, but they must have looked at it and thought about it, right? So this is the example of a cumulative impacts assessment that was accepted in a permit that was approved. It's not even the whole page, it's just that paragraph right there. This is their assessment, cumulative impacts. And again, this was not a minor project, this was a pipeline. No, electricity transmission line, which would have very similar ideas, but everything was boiled down to here, and it basically says, there's no cumulative impacts, there's nothing to worry about. It was approved. So that's, and we've seen that pretty consistently. That's something that happens regularly. And I will say in Pennsylvania, there's very little case law on it at all, which means that it hasn't been challenged, it hasn't been dealt with, and I'm going to say, at least partially as a result, it's not being taken seriously. Other reasons for that, I think, quite frankly, part of the problem we're seeing, at least in Pennsylvania, is just confusion on the part of overworked people, government officials. These are very thick applications. Again, that was number 14 of a list of, I don't know how many things they have to consider when they're reviewing applications. This is long, it's tedious. There's a lot to go through. We're talking cumulative impacts. And again, the check form just says the words cumulative impacts. Well, here's another place this is PASP GP4 screening form. So basically, I don't need to get into the details, but federal and state permits can be considered at the same time. Basically, it's a streamlined process for these kinds of projects. Somebody mentioned earlier, talking about there's basically a threshold limit at which the federal government actually has to come in and look at it and consider whether it's, consider the permitting decision on its own instead of following the state's combined permit process. So the way that they determine whether the federal government actually has to step in, whether that threshold has been met, is through this form, which is called very helpfully Cumulative Impacts Project Screening Form. And what they mean by cumulative impacts on this form is what's the impact of this project. And this is where we're coming down to just looking at this project, we're saying, does it meet the 0.25 acres or not? How many acres of wetlands are being disturbed by this project? What's the area that we're looking at of this project? So I think part of what we're seeing is, I think as the officials are going through this, they're probably making a good faith effort to implement the law as they see it, but I think part of what's happening, they're seeing cumulative impacts, they're thinking, this cumulative impacts, what are the cumulative impacts of this project, rather than cumulative impacts of every other project that has happened, will happen, and is reasonably foreseen to happen in the future. And you can understand from the perspective of the agency, both the agency and the industry, why they may not be all that excited about trying to dive into something like this, if they can get away with it. So again, how can you get involved in this process, which I think needs some help desperately? First thing you can do, look at the Pennsylvania Bulletin. Most of you are probably familiar with it. It's analogous to the Federal Register on the federal level. It's just announcement of actions that are being taken by the state government. They will, if there's a Chapter 105 permit, it'll be listed in the Pennsylvania Bulletin when the application is received. So monitor the Pennsylvania Bulletin for that. It comes out every Saturday. Look for one in your area. I'm sorry?
That is online.
It is on, yeah, it is online. If you I don't know the website off the top of my head, but if you Google Pennsylvania Bulletin, it's pretty easy to access, and it's actually reasonably easy to search. It's pretty user-friendly. I'll give them credit for that. Again, it comes out once a week, and if you click through enough links, you can just search the term that you're looking for. And you can find, see if there's anything in your area that you may be interested in following up on. If you do find an application, you can get a copy of the application from DEP. You can do that either by performing a file review, which means yourself just going to you have to set this up in advance, but the forms for that are online too. Going into a DEP office, getting a copy of the file, and you'd have access to make a copy of it, but you can, look at the file and review, see what's in there. You can do the same thing through a right to know law request and just request that the agency send it to you. That's going to cost at least some money. It's usually not prohibitive, but these are pretty big documents. Once you've done that, submit a comment letter to DEP, basically saying, these are the cumulative impacts that we think you should consider. I know about these other projects that are in this area. This is the impact I think it's going to have on the resources that are present. Please consider it in your impacts. And if appropriate, if the agency doesn't take it seriously, you can initiate an appeal of the DEP permit issuance before the Environmental Hearing Board.
I heard that term earlier, I'm not familiar. Is that a state agency?
The Environmental Hearing Board. Yeah, sorry, I probably should mention that. The Environmental Hearing Board it's technically, it's basically an administrative judiciary kind of hearing. It's one of those sorts of setups. The EHB has jurisdiction over a challenge to any DEP action in Pennsylvania, basically.
A challenge to any
DEP action in Pennsylvania. And so that's the first place you would appeal. If, once the EHB makes the decision, if one side or the other appeals, then it goes into the traditional court system. But the initial appeal would be handled by the Environmental Hearing Board, which has its own different procedures and everything, so it helps if you're familiar with them.
Mike, have you found it easy to get into DEP for your file reviews in a timely manner to meet your 30 days?
I feel like that was a softball question she teed up for me. I appreciate that. No, it's not, and that's part of the problem is, if you look at the law, what it will tell you is within 30 days of this permit, the notice of this permit application being published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, you're supposed to submit your comments within 30 days of that. Now, if you see this on Saturday, you write to DEP on Monday saying, I want a file review, it could very well, depending on the region, take a month and a half for you to get in there. So, we usually submit the comments anyway, because what other choice do we have? And DEP will usually at least consider them on some level. Whether or not they actually take them seriously is another question, but yeah, it's a good point.
Appears in the bulletin, you have 30 days to make the comment.
Technically.
Well, can I just to be clear on that, it depends on the kind of project. If it's sometimes the notice in the bulletin will merely be notice of an application being received. That's not going to trigger a 30-day period to comment. That's just going to let you know that an application's been received. Gives you what will trigger a 30-day period is if it's a notice of intent to issue permit. That's a different kind of notice in the PA bulletin. That gives you 30 days before to get your comments, or if they provide a 60-day period, that's possible. But there are situations where it's simply a permit application that's been received and there's a notice provided. Now, maybe Michael, you have certain Michael, right?
Yeah.
There may be certain kinds of actions that you're specifically referring to. Can you specify those?
Yeah, no, I mean, my understanding was that even still, for the application, you were, at least for NPDES permits, you're supposed to get comments in within 30 days. Now, again, it's less jurisdictional than some of the things you're talking about, and maybe less critical. But my understanding was there was still a 30-day period, even for, at least for NPDES permits. But
not if it's just a notice of an application received. That's basically letting you know that they have the application,
right.
And it could be many months before the DEP is ready to issue the permit,
right.
Because they can't necessarily do an analysis of a 500-page permit application in 30 days,
and they never do.
Right?
They never do.
So there is going to be, if you're really on top of it, folks, with your PA Bulletin reviews, you can catch these things the first time they come up before DEP is ready to act. And that's your best chance.
Absolutely.
There are other situations, but sometimes you're not going to know what DEP intends to do, and so maybe you don't take action. You do find yourself behind the 8 ball of only having 30 days to see what DEP looked at and comment, and that is very tough. You're right. And sometimes you could be 3 weeks out before DEP schedules you, even if you've seen the bulletin the day it came out.
Yeah, and that's why we would, definitely recommend get in at this stage right here where we're talking about the application, the notice of the application coming out. This is where you want to get involved for exactly the reasons you're talking about. It's early in the process. DEP can actually take it into consideration. They're not reversing it. They're not basically redoing something that they've already done. Get in early and do it as fast as you can.
My experience is in New Jersey, and depending upon what law the permit is being reviewed under, there could be there's a 90-day construction law where they have to make a decision within 90 days, or there's an automatic permit approval, or they can get an extension for another 30 days.
Right.
Other laws do not have as strict a mandate for the reviewing agency to make a decision in a specific time period. And the other thing that can happen is that applications can be declared incomplete,
Right.
and then there's no clock on them. But the one thing that I found works regardless is calling the agency that's got the review, got the application under review, and try to talk to the individual who has been assigned to review a given project. This can't always work because those people are tremendously overloaded,
Yeah.
but if you pose a relevant question in a non-confrontational manner, they'll often give you more information than you were hoping to get.
Yeah. And again, that's why getting in as early as you can absolutely makes sense.
Is there any sort of list of previously approved projects that a designer or applicant could use as in their analysis of cumulative impacts?
You can, so there are different ways. I don't know that there's one database where you can get that. You can access them. Anything that DEP has approved, you can get through the file review process. It's not necessarily available easily online. You can find the applications through, DEP has what's called the EFAX system. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but you can go through, find out which Chapter 105 permits they've issued within whatever time period, geographic area you're looking at. You can find it that way. And then go in and get the documents from DEP through a file review or public notice. I don't know that you're going to find a great example if that's what you're looking for. I think we're going to see a lot of things like I showed before, where it's just one paragraph, which shows you what DEP approved, not necessarily what I would consider a model cumulative impacts statement.
Does DEP have regional offices that process these permits?
Yes.
Or are they all going into?
They're all processed by regional. There are 6 different regional offices.
So you have to know what division
Yeah.
gets a particular application.
Right. Right. We can talk about that separately. But
They'll show that in the PA Bulletin notice. They'll tell you which region it's out of.
Thank you.
and it's all based on geography as well. So even if you're looking, EFAX may not necessarily have that, but it will tell you what the township and county is, and it's all based on counties in Pennsylvania, which counties are covered by which regional offices. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is sort of other Pennsylvania permits. General permits for NPDES have to consider individually or cumulatively will not cause a violation of water quality standards. And exceptional value waters, and this is interesting, I'll just note briefly, this came from case law. A 1999 EHB case says that DEP has to consider the cumulative effects of a series of similar permits in the same watershed if we're talking about exceptional value waters. So that's another instance of a place where courts have come in and said, not good enough, folks. ESCGP, these are basically erosion and sedimentation controls for oil and gas operations, general permit. DEP has to make a cumulative impacts judgment when they're issuing the general permit. Mining context, this is another example where we're seeing cumulative impacts, and again, if you look at them, these may not be this. In fact, they're almost certainly not, but at least it's there. The concept is there in the law. Okay, so there's very little time left at this point. I think we have about 7 minutes left. I just wanted to talk briefly about some other ways to think of cumulative impacts. What we just talked about, that's kind of a traditional cumulative impacts assessment. That's what, when you hear cumulative impacts, when people are talking about it, that's probably what they're talking about. They're thinking about something that ideally looks like this, often in reality looks like this. But that's what they're talking about. We're focused on a project. We're thinking about all of the other impacts that may have an effect on the same resources as the project we're talking about. You'll never hear, I very rarely hear TMDL talked about in the context of cumulative impacts, but I think it's fair to think about it as a cumulative impacts assessment. I think most people know what TMDLs are. If not, I'll just talk briefly about that. States are required to develop a list of waters that are considered impaired. They don't meet their water quality standards and this is a federal law requirement. So for any impaired water, the state has to develop what's called a TMDL, total maximum daily load, which basically says, all right, we want the water to attain this level of quality. It's not there now. What's the total amount of pollution that it can take in while still meeting the quality. And of course, it's going to be less pollution than it's currently receiving. And as a result of that, that total load is then going to be allocated amongst the different pollution sources. So if there's an industry over here that's discharging water, or water with that pollutants in it, and an MS4 over here that's discharging that water, this will be incorporated into those permits. And so basically it's a limit on the pollution that's being released into that body of water from point sources in the area. So really, what's happening is, bottom line, this is almost a cumulative impacts analysis on water pollution in that watershed. We're talking for an individual permit. So obviously we're not talking about every resource and every different conceivable effects you could have on it, but in a very strict sense, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, what's the total impact we're going to have on this water body? What are we okay with? And how do we allocate that impact? Basically, it's kind of working backwards. And of course, this only happens when the water's been found to be impaired, but.
Yep. What you're saying, I would agree with fully, but I don't put much stack in the TMDL process, because as the DEP told the Fish Commission last year, when the Fish Commission was asking for the Susquehanna River main stem to be considered impaired and so they could prepare a TMDL, DEP refused to do it. They said, well, if they did consider it to be impaired and to require a TMDL, that would just put it on a 17-year clock, and they wouldn't start doing anything until at least 15 years from now. So there's not a whole lot to that program. That's something that has a big bluster and not much substance.
Yeah, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I think it does have at least a little bit of teeth once there is a TMDL in place, because it does have to be incorporated into the permit. It takes forever. There's a really long list of impaired waters that it's going to take forever to get to. But once we finally get there, this is, again, I'm talking about this as a conceptual model, really. This is another way to think of cumulative impacts and maybe address it in some contexts. So,
Yeah, I was in college. I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
excuse me, Jim. I was in college when the Clean Water Act was passed, and was taking a course issued by the instructor was involved in getting it passed. He was working in Washington. And he stated that the goal of fishable, swimmable, drinkable waters is going to be accomplished in 10 years. Well, that was 1972, and it's now 40-some years. And it hasn't happened, and there's a long ways to go. I'm at the point where maybe my children or grandchildren will see the list of impaired waters diminish significantly. But where it becomes important is for those waterways or waterway segments in New Jersey, now they're doing it, where there is an existing TMDL, you have one more hook on which you can use to catch people that are doing things you don't like.
absolutely.
And in New Jersey, at least, most of the problem is non-point source pollution, for which the best solution is education.
I would argue that the state and national government needs an adequate database to do analysis that is not laughable, where you're not submitting a paragraph analysis because you have adequate scientific data to back up your statement.
I completely agree. And that's part, I think we're seeing some of that being developed slowly, but we're not even close. And the places we're seeing it developed, I think, are in areas where there's been more stringent analysis required, especially under NEPA, those kinds of projects. Okay, this is another place we've seen it, and this came up this morning in the presentation, the Environmental Rights Amendment under the Pennsylvania Constitution. This is, we've heard this morning, that's the text of the amendment, and the Robinson Township case that they were discussing this morning, these are some quotes that come from that case where they're talking about things that could impact cumulative impacts under the Environmental Rights Amendment. It says, they recognize that environmental changes, whether positive or negative, have the potential to be incremental, have a compounding effect, and develop over generations, exactly what we're talking about. The Environmental Rights Amendment offers protection equally against actions with immediate severe impact on public natural resources and against actions with minimal or insignificant present consequences that are actually or likely to have significant or irreversible effects on the short or long term. Sorry, lawyers write this way, I apologize. But basically, this is I view this as the plurality opinion, the plurality justices in the Robinson Township case saying, there's cumulative impacts cumulative impacts analysis that's required under the Pennsylvania Constitution. We'll see what courts do with that. I don't think that's been tested, at least as far as I know it hasn't, since that there's some risks involved with litigating anything under this case. For lawyers in the room, it's a plurality opinion, not a majority opinion, which affects, it technically doesn't have precedential value, which is dangerous. We have 3 new Supreme Court justices that are going to be elected in November, 3 out of 7, that's a big number. Anything having to do with Robinson Township is very tentative and very risky. It's encouraging, it's great, it's exciting, but we need to be careful about how we approach it if we want it to stay the way it is. But anyway, the takeaway message for me from this analysis is that there may be a requirement under the cumulative impact, or under the Pennsylvania Constitution, that requires cumulative impacts analysis. And okay, this is the NAC standard under air pollution. It's in some ways analogous to a TMDL. It's very different, but same sort of idea. It's another way of possibly thinking about cumulative impacts. All right, I think we're out of time now, but these are some of the things that, if we did have time, I wanted to talk about a little bit. And to me, one of the big questions is, how should we approach cumulative impact? Should we approach each resource differently? We talked about TMDLs for water, NACs for air. Should we approach each resource and say, basically have a sum total of pollution that we can tolerate and then divide it up basically like we've done in TMDLs? Is that the way to approach it? What about, would that work for something like deforestation or wetlands impacts? How do we approach that? Is a standard traditional cumulative impacts analysis better or worse? I don't know. It's, I don't have the answer to any of these questions. I think they're interesting. I think they're something we should think about. And, it may help us as we're trying to convince agencies to look at analyses and develop analyses that look like this. Maybe we can think of better, more efficient ways to address cumulative impacts, and maybe we can use that to set policy going forward. And, instead of threatening litigation to shut down government agencies in some ways, maybe we can use this as a bargaining chip and say, all right, you have to be doing this according to the Pennsylvania Constitution, but here's an easier way of doing it. Or not. I don't know. But I think that's all I have. You have?
New Jersey has something called Executive Order 53, which was issued back in the 70s, that said if a project just has state money in it and it's above $2 million back then the agency proposing the work was required to do something comparable to an EIS or an EA.
Okay.
Or does Pennsylvania have something comparable to that for
All right, thank you, everybody.